So that should get us all situated, and I'll hand it back. I think Russo will probably get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Hekili. As he said, this is our first Discord community event night. If you want to watch some visuals, Word Up is streaming. He's doing it through Discord streaming. If you're looking for a Twitch stream or anything like that, just click on him in Discord and hit tune in. So this is kind of a work in progress. We're just feeling this out, seeing what's going to work, what's not going to work, and so there will be some improvements in the future. And after this is over, we'll have some format or submission for if anybody has any suggestions or improvements, or what they thought worked well, what didn't work well. Ultimately, we want this about. Ultimately, we're doing this for you guys. There's not going to be any plans to monetize this or make it a large production. It's specific for the community. We want to make sure that you guys are informed and are able to engage with parts of the content in the game that you're not able to interact with yet. So we do have a basic schedule. The first thing we want to talk about are the major. What does Shadowlands look like? More so than just like, oh hey, it's we're into Zarlor again, but specifically the mechanical systems. What did they bring back? What did they remove? So I think Word Up, if you have the display, if you want to show some of that off.
Yeah, can run us through how it plays right now. Obviously, it's with talents involved, but generally speaking, you'll see the rough flow of the spec. It's not too dissimilar from Warlords for anyone who played it before. You can see that a lot of the things around downtime has been slightly exaggerated in places. It's actually fairly well functioning. It happens here or there, especially if you make mistakes. But we have a reasonably well functioning rotation, even at extremely low gear levels. There's a lot of buttons to press. It's a little more active than BFA, especially given that we're no longer really a one button spec.
So some things that are gone, things like Rockbiter have been removed, which was previously one of our primary Maelstrom generators. Maelstrom itself is gone. We have Maelstrom Weapon now. And Maelstrom Weapon no longer, so with that resource change, it changes what our resources get spent on. Previously we had Maelstrom, which spent everything. Stormstrike cost some amount of Maelstrom, Lava Lash cost some amount. Pretty much every ability, unless it was an explicit generator, like Rockbiter, would cost some amount of resource. Now, most of your abilities are free. Well, free-ish. There's some level of mana involved with some things, like healing is mana limited, but for the most part, everything's free.
Yeah, the resource that you have to think about now instead is more the cooldown of the ability that you're using. That's what you're having to manage.
And that's what I'm alluding to. With the lack of any kind of physical resource for the majority of your abilities, we kind of go back to that Cataclysm, Mop, Warlord style, where your resource is the intrinsic cooldown of your actual abilities. You have to think about how many frost shocks per minute am I limited to? Because you're not resource. You're not, your ability to cast is not gated by having enough Maelstrom or Maelstrom Weapon. It's how many times per minute can you use it. If it's a 5-second cooldown, that's 12 uses per minute. That's your resources. I have 12 shocks a minute. Frost Shock and Flame Shock share cooldown, so you kind of have to think of it that way.
I would also expand on that point in that it's not just the cooldowns of the abilities, it's also how they line up with each other. Casting like ability A and then ability B, for example, might cause their cooldowns to like always line up with each other, but if you reverse them, then they can get desynced, for example, and that creates a better flow so that you're not like every time ability B is coming up, you always have to delay it by a GCD, because like if you cast it before or after ability A, like the lineups will change.
Yeah, so you can see right
plan that
now.
out throughout like a longer duration of like how these ability clones line up with each other, how the order affects like the number of cooldown conflicts that you'll create, and you want to minimize the conflicts as much as possible to get as many uses over time as possible.
Which is mostly where Maelstrom Weapon comes in, where that's like the switch up in the rotation, where you use your lightning bolts or chain lightning to sort of reset some of the sinks that can happen ultimately that you can't stop, because eventually that does occur. So Maelstrom throws a wrench in that and resets it a bit if you manage it properly.
Yeah, and to the point that Purge brought up, yeah, you totally made that shit up. To the point that Purge brought up, you know, that cooldown limiting and using your abilities in a ways that, you know, flow together better is where the complexity of the spec is going to come from. Is figuring out in my next 2 to 3 GCDs. At any given time, you need to be thinking about what your next 2 to 3 GCDs are and how that's going to interact with other things that are coming up. So a lot of classes have a priority system where abilities are like, you use the highest damage thing in order so that you can make sure that, you know, you get it on cool. But that's not necessarily the case. You know, there may be times that you displace something in order to get things to line up better later. So it's definitely going to be a little jarring to a lot of players that started in Legion and Warlords. You know, that's going to add a fair amount of disruption into how you think about how you used to play Enhancement.
Legion and BFA.
What did I say?
Warlords.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I meant like after Warlords. Yeah, sorry.
Before continuing forward, would it be possible for Rusa or Purge, one of you, to also load a stream, since we're already up against the limit for how many folks can watch Word Up stream? Would that be possible?
Yeah, I have mine up. Let me make sure it's actually running. I didn't realize that Discord had a limit like that.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it's 50 or so, and we're there. And it may then also, yeah, if we could use your Twitch link, Rusa, maybe that would have some more capacity.
Yeah, it's up. I will post it and pin it in the Community Night channel.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So that's kind of the gist of what Shadowlands is going to look like. We don't have a whole lot of specifics on like, you know, what's the rotation, what's the priority, because it's so far off. There's probably still going to be several design changes. So really, all we can talk is in broad terms of here's the general concept of how the class plays. Purge or Word Up, if you want to talk, because I personally didn't play Enhancement for the vast majority of BFA. I leveled to 120 and was like, okay, I'm good. I was not a fan of what BFA turned out to be. So Word and Purge, if you guys played it all expansion, if you want to talk about BFA, how that changes, and you know, what's good, what's bad.
So the biggest immediate shock that someone's going to get when they log in is in BFA. Everything ultimately culminates in how many times you can press Stormstrike. That's your go-to. Everything you do is funneling solely into getting the most amount of Stormstrikes that you can possibly get out of your rotation. And nothing else really matters that much. Whereas here, there is a lot more moving parts that happen that you need to consider when you're doing your rotation. Mostly as alluded to with the cooldown management, juggling, and so on. And also not wasting any Maelstrom stacks in between that. So it's a little bit more methodical, it's a little bit more measured, and I would tentatively say it's a little bit less random than live currently is and has been for a while. And there's a lot of mitigating tools that go into that, especially in the AoE department, that let you be a little bit more in control of what's going on.
I would also say that that's probably the design intent at least, but I don't know if the tuning supports it necessarily. Like, I still think Stormstrike is like the dominant push this as much as you can button on alpha.
Yeah, that's true. although we don't have Stormbringer nearly as often now, it's more of like a flavor event that occurs rather than something that you are gunning for at all times that happens a lot more frequently.
Yeah, and I mean, to get to Rusa's point about sitting out the expansion, I kind of did sit out the beginning of this expansion because I was also not too thrilled with how BFA started for enhancement. And it hasn't really ever been fixed so much as the tuning is just brought up to a point where the spec isn't like completely dead, so like I can run with it. The main issue that I have, and I think many people have with live enhancement gameplay, is that the Stormstrike spam just gets to be a bit degenerate, where, like, you know, you have this resource that you don't care about, like, all it does is let you cast Lava Lash more frequently, and that is not an exciting thing at all. Like, your main hitter is actually cooldown restricted, but not really, because Stormbringer resets its cooldown, and when it does that, it also makes it not cost any resource. So, like, Maelstrom doesn't really have a place in the spec, like it doesn't feel like it fits. So them removing it in in Shadowlands is like a good step in the right direction. I don't, again, though, because of the tuning, I don't necessarily think a Maelstrom Weapon fixes the entire problem that Maelstrom had, because again, Lightning Bolt is a low priority button on Shadowlands because it just doesn't hit hard. So you get into a point again where you're generating this resource, and the only way to spend it is on hitting like a button that isn't very exciting. In AoE, it's a little bit better because of the crash lightning interaction. Though again, chain lightning itself isn't an exciting button. It's only that interaction that's making it feel good right now in AoE, and also the overtuning of Hailstorm, which spending Maelstrom buffs Hailstorm or buffs your Frost Shock to make it hit like a truck. But that's just, again, a tuning problem where Hailstorm is just still overtuned even after they cut the bonus in half.
Yeah, if you're watching, you know, a big Stormstrike will deal about 1500 damage. After a buffed Hailstorm, you know, just crit for 3k on 2 targets. Like, that's obviously a tuning issue.
Hailstorm sits in the same realm as Sundering, what happens maybe 3-4 times as often. So it's fairly obvious that that one's going to come down. But I think the bigger takeaway that we can move on to, that we're going to talk about anyway, is that the design goal that they need to hit, in particular with Maelstrom, is that it needs to be the end point of a cycle, as it were. If you were to picture it as like a 15-second cycle between all of your buttons, when you press Maelstrom, that resets the cycle, and that's the big button payoff moment, as opposed to what we have on live, where the big button payoff moment is what you press sometimes every second or less.
Yeah, and we'll expand on that later. But that's kind of, I agree as well. One of the big sticking points right now is Maelstrom Weapon. Is it a filler or is it a finisher? As it's tuned right now, it's a filler. So you just.
But design-wise, the spec would feel a lot better if it was the finisher.
Yeah, and I'm in full agreement. You know, everything. You can essentially map out all the ability interactions, and in some extent, everything leads to Maelstrom Weapon. You know, a lot of buttons lead to Stormstrike. Stormstrike is the button that's most likely to generate you the most amount of Maelstrom Weapon. Everything kind of leads in that direction. So if as it is right now, it's this weird, like, you know, A to B to A thing where, you know, you're doing fillers and Stormstrikes and fillers, and Maelstrom Weapon spenders right now are part of that.
It's also very important to note
this linear progression towards a big button, and we don't have that.
It's very important to note that Maelstrom Weapon isn't RPPM or anything like that. It's just a flat % chance to happen.
Yeah, 20% chance on all your melee abilities.
So the more hits that you do, so in AoE with Crash Lightning, you're getting multiple hits, multiple Windfuries, and so on. That's a higher % chance to generate stacks, and you can generate multiples, which is why Stormstrike is the quickest path to Maelstrom.
And I suppose there's another thing to briefly touch on in terms of the transition from BFA to Shadowlands, that some people, like, because we're no longer Maelstrom limited, we're cooldown limited, any ability you have that does damage, like including Crash Lightning, is just part of your single target rotation now. Like you're going to be weaving all of those abilities in, no matter what they are. Like even if you wouldn't in on live, although technically you do on live, like it's part of the priority in Shadowlands, and that's, I think a lot of people don't realize that, and that's why some people like on the public forums or like maybe YouTube personalities might be complaining about there being more downtime than there actually is because they're not actually using all of the buttons available to them to fill that downtime.
Yeah, in Legion and BFA, it was not uncommon, but not typical that Crash Lightning would be a button that you would hit in single target. Whereas now, like Purge said, everything that does damage when you don't have something else to press is a button worth pressing.
And because it doesn't cost anything, the only displacement it has is with the cooldowns. But if everything else is on cooldown, it's effectively just filling a button that would otherwise be left empty.
Okay, so that's kind of our thoughts on you know, what Shadowlands has now, how it's different from BFA. We can go a little bit on kind of what I've personally been referring to as rotational directives. Now, it's not necessarily a rotation, but it's directives of how you play the class, and I break it down into three things: generate and consume Stormbringer, generate and consume Maelstrom Weapon, reduce downtime. Now, not necessarily those aren't necessarily in any kind of order of importance, but those are generally the three goals of the spec. You want to push things that generate Stormbringer, and you want to make sure you spend Stormbringer. You want to push things that are going to generate Maelstrom Weapon, and then not waste your Maelstrom Weapon stacks. And then, as we've been talking about all this cooldown limiting stuff, cooldown being your resource, you want to reduce the amount of time that you're not pushing anything.
Can I ask you a quick question about when you say not waste Maelstrom weapon stacks? Is that talking in terms of spending them prematurely or overcapping or both? What does that mean exactly?
It's very important to note that because of the change that they made to make it go to 10 stacks, it only ever consumes 5. So you've effectively got a 5-stack float that you're going to use to weave it into the rotation, unless you say you immediately need a burst of damage, assuming that the tuning around it goes towards fixing the mechanical problem of it not feeling like a finisher. The idea is that you don't ever sit at 10 and burn stacks that could be generated, but you don't need to immediately press it at 5, because that's the float in between where you can hover between 6, 7, 8, 9.
Basically, there's no rush to hit Lightning Bolt and displace a different GCD when you could just hit that other GCD and then use Lightning Bolt, and you haven't like wasted any charges or anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can essentially think of your Maelstrom spenders as a 2-charge system. You know, a lot of abilities get 2 charges, like Warrior Bloodthirst is a good example, so that it's an important button, but you can hit it when you need to, as opposed to having to hit it on cooldown all the time.
If you think of them similar to how like energy and combo points would work, Maelstrom Weapon is a lot more like energy, and your ability cooldowns are like combo points. Once the combo points are filled, you need to immediately spend them, because anything further than that is wasted. Just like once the ability is ready, you need to press it immediately, or else you're wasting generation time with the cooldown. Whereas Maelstrom Weapon is a bit more like energy, where you can float a bit as long as it's not capped, and then fill it in with that.
Yeah, and that's something worth pointing out that Purge said. You know, he put a lot of emphasis on there's no need to hit it right away. And I think that this is one of those cases where the majority of players are going to get either confused, not necessarily confused, misled by what the UI design does, because the UI lights up all your buttons as soon as you're at 5, because it's telling you your buttons are activatable at instant cast. And it's going to be real tempting to hit those the instant they light up. And that's definitely something people are going to have to train themselves not to do.
Although, inverse, it is a rush to hit it if you're at 10 stack.
Yeah.
In those cases, there is like small caveats to it, but it is generally a much more flexible system than it appears when the game tells you to press it.
Correct. Yeah. So probably if they don't improve the UI, because right now let me generate some stacks. Show you what it looks like. So you've got this indicator in the middle that tells you when you're at 5 stacks. But I'm actually at 6 right now, 7. So it's not, the UI currently is not doing a great job of reporting to you how many stacks you really have. So I unless we don't get any UI updates, I expect that there will be probably some add-on or weak or support people are going to want to track that.
Which is another thing as well to say that right now I would say that the reliance on things like weak auras and add-ons and so on is probably a bit higher than it has been in BFA, because there is a lot more going on that might not be able to float in your head when you're playing.
One thing I want to interject really quick, some people probably may have seen me just spend 10 stacks on a single spell. Maelstrom Weapon's really buggy on the alpha right now.
Yeah, there are some quirks with it, and there's also quirks with the UI element as well, where I'm sure you'll see between both streams it linger, even though there's no stacks.
Yeah,
but it's slowly improving.
Yeah, definitely. I expect that. Actually, I expect that they'll fix it quickly, but I could have absolutely no guess on when they're going to get around to fixing class bugs. So how are we on time? So we're at the 25-minute point. So let's talk about what we think are the remaining major issues. You know, where do us, like me, Word, and Purge, where do we think the class needs to go before beta's over in order for the kit to feel complete, in our opinions? And we've kind of narrowed it down to 3 major issues. Maelstrom Weapon spenders, as we've mentioned before, are they fillers or are they finishers? That tuning point is going to be extremely important for how the class feels when you play it. So we already talked about that, so I won't go into it too in depth. The only thing I'll add to that is an interesting thing about it is, depending on where that tuning ends up, that won't majorly change the way you play the class. Because even if like Lightning Bolt or Elemental Blast, you know, all the Maelstrom Weapon spenders are tuned to be powerful finishers, you're still going to play the class in a way that maximizes spending the Maelstrom Weapon while reducing downtime. So all those things that we said about fitting it in between other abilities to make sure that you get things on cooldown while not wasting stacks, that's not going to change if Lightning Bolt does a ton more damage. It's just going to feel a lot better.
And just for reference, when we say that they should do more damage, like I think they need to do in the ballpark of like 2 or 3 times as much damage as they're currently doing. Like they're really, really weak right now.
I'm getting pretty unlucky trying to get some stacks at the moment.
Pop your wolves.
So I've got 6 stacks. A Lightning Bolt does 1100. I mean, that's, you know, less than half of a Stormstrike. You know, I'm in the opinion it should do like close to double.
There's also a factor as well that
to make room for that, and that's fine.
There's the factor as well that it doesn't necessarily just need to be damage. If you look at Chain Lightning does feel very good just solely because of the hook that they added. And if they opted to do that instead with Lightning Bolt, it's possible that could be an avenue that they go down. But the main point is that it needs to feel like an endpoint. Like
for those that aren't,
the push
for those
that you do.
aren't aware, the hook that he's talking about is Crash Lightning. Each target struck by Chain Lightning reduces the cooldown of Crash Lightning. So you can see I crash.
And increases
Chain
damage.
Lightning. Yeah, and additionally increases its damage.
So it means that
effectively
without that hook beforehand, our AoE rotation was quite empty. There was unavoidable downtime in which you'd be pressing buttons that you generally would rather not be pressing in AoE situations. Whereas with this, what it does is it means that every button that you press, especially if you involve some of the better designed talents like Hailstorm, make it flow very smoothly. It creates a real A to B to C point in the rotation during AoE. And those kinds of hooks are really, really useful. That really improved the way that we play.
So finishers definitely, or the Maelstrom Weapon spenders, definitely a sticking point that we think needs addressing. The next thing is weapon imbues. they're pretty boring. They don't do much. Purge, if you want to talk about that.
I mean, I would even like again, some people like. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here, but I do feel like this is one of the worst iterations of weapon imbues that we've ever had, in the sense that even way back when like in like classic or TBC, when there was a correct choice to having your weapon imbues, like whether it was like double Windfury or like Windfury Flametongue, or like there was usually like a correct choice in those other expansions. But like design wise, at least, there were still other options available to you, and there were situations at times where you'd want to use those options, and there were also at times when we had other abilities that more directly interacted with our weapon abuse, like unleash elements and stuff, and you could do cool things like, you know, taunting spiders down on Beth Dalak, or taunting Ragnaros into like root patches or whatever, and things like that with unleash Rockbiter and those sorts of things. Now, like, we literally only have two weapon imbues, Windfury and Flametongue. They are literally like specifically designed to only be useful on one of the two weapons. Like Windfury only affects your main hand now. Flametongue is supposed to only affect your offhand now. So there's no decision making involved. There's no situational strengths and weaknesses. Like there's no more like, oh, maybe I want to use Frostbrand in PvP. Frostbrand just doesn't exist anymore, right? So like there's no like real any gameplay hook to the existence of these abilities anymore. It's like they're almost like transmog or RP in a way, where it's just like you have the fantasy of enchanting your weapons, and that's literally all that they're useful for. And I think that they could be a whole lot more than that.
Yeah, very well put. I don't really have anything to add to that. I take it back. There are some minor talent hooks. Forceful
Yeah,
Wind,
that isn't to
Offhand, Storm
say that
Fury.
the imbues that exist are inherently boring. There are interesting hooks attached to Windfury. Less so with Flametongue, but there are interesting things attached to one of them. The point is more they could be expanded further if they want to bring them back. And even more so then capitalized upon, just like the talents do for things like Windfury.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities. Also, the PvP community will probably be very sad to lose Frostbrand. Frostbrand was a staple of just being unkiteable that shamans used to have. I think that's one of the cases of, even if they don't bring it back to the main kit, that could be an appropriate maybe talent for enhancement, a PvP talent for enhancement shaman. But there's definitely examples of, like, even in the past when there was a correct choice, there was still alternate uses for the other ones that saw use. So weapon imbues, definitely a major issue. And then the final one, which is pretty related to the weapon imbues, is what has been coined ability to ability interactions, and you see that all over the place. The most recent example being the chain lightning to crash lightning. Chain lightning, crash lightning is an ability that massively generates Maelstrom Weapon. You can spend that Maelstrom Weapon on chain lightning, which massively amplifies crash lightning. So that's a good example of an ability to ability interaction. Windfury Weapon and Stormbringer. Windfury Weapon counts as a main hand weapon attack, which generates Stormbringer, which generates Stormstrikes, which has a high chance of generating Windfury Weapon, and you get a nice feedback loop. In a recent major patch on the alpha, they removed some of the abilities that lacked those ability interactions, such as Rockbiter, Searing Totem. They just existed as buttons to deal damage when you couldn't press anything else. And so,
Which is
Blizzard,
an important point,
decided...
just to interject on that one. While a lot of people didn't like that, or there were people who didn't like that Rockbiter was removed, the fact that Rockbiter serves no purpose, both in the tree for what talents they had existing there, and also that it was very bland innately, it being removed really isn't something that you feel as long as the rest of the rotation is smoothed out, which it has been. So the things that have been removed aren't something that should be concerning to anyone who's looking at those removals. There is a reason that they've gone.
Yeah, well put. And unless you had some strange attraction to Rockbiter, they've really been replaced by shocks, which you have that are new. So it's kind of different coat of paint. Just that a lot of those buttons have better interactions. I personally think that it's okay for the shock spells to have less of those interactions and probably be supported by talent hooks. But we still have a couple of abilities that are lacking those ability interactions. We had some abilities that remained that are still pretty lame. If you want to go into that, Purge.
Well, I think the
I think
biggest.
Lava Lash is a big one.
I mean, kind of like Lava Lash interacts with Flame Tongue in the sense that it passively buffs its damage, right? There's no like gameplay necessarily interaction there, but like there's an interaction in name. But more concerning is just the fire abilities in general. It feels like there's a lot of jigsaw pieces that don't fit together. Like trying to play the spread your flame shocks around, you know, tab your lava lash buff around for the searing assault talent or whatever, or lashing flames talent to buff them, and then like fire novaing all those like flame shocks. It's very hectic, and it doesn't feel like like any of those abilities like really work together. Like
Yeah,
they still don't feel like they're designed to work well with each other.
I agree in particular with the jigsaw piece situation where it feels like there are a lot of pieces that are there, but there's one thing, like the piece right in the middle, that's missing to make it all flow together. So there is a theme that could work, but right now the theme misses a fundamental part of that to actually operate properly.
And now I'm not playing it very well, but if you look on stream, like, if you're trying to support this playstyle, there's just way too many things to try to hit. Like, you basically end up trying to choose between, do I try to focus on getting my flame shocks around while trying to get all these other abilities out? Like, you just end up with this massive overflow of, do I focus on trying to get this cool fire spreading thing, or do I deal with this massive influx of, you know, Windfury Weapon stacks from Crash Lightning, or not Windfury, sorry, Maelstrom Weapon stacks from Crash Lightning, and now I'm wasting my Lashing Flames ability because, you know, I'm trying to get Flame Shock out on a different target. It just doesn't work together. You have these two competing playstyles that don't mesh together.
And to expand on that, we currently only have one way to make it easier to spread flame shocks to multiple targets, and it's in a different talent that's mutually exclusive with Fire Nova. The fact that it's a talent, again, I'm not too thrilled with. Like, I don't think one talent should enable the ability to use another. I would rather there be some baseline spreading flame shocks is a bit easier just as part of the base kit, so that Fire Nova can just be cool on its own. Like, it doesn't need Cycle of the Elements to support it. I think Cycle of the Elements should just do either a different thing, or there should be a different hook that encourages multi-dotting Flame Shock to make it exciting to do that on its own, because obviously Flame Shock doesn't do a lot of damage on its own. It can't do a lot of damage on its own because it's not the ultimate payoff moment. Like, it's not Stormstrike, it's not the Maelstrom spells. Like, you can't also shove a bunch of damage into Flame Shock to make it so that the damage that it does alone is rewarding when you're spreading those extra flame shocks out.
And
so, like, I don't
moreover,
think
as well,
Cycle of the Elements works.
Cycle of the Elements also takes 2 global cooldowns to actually get the payoff in an already very cluttered situation where you're trying to juggle the shocks and press the Fire Novas and use your Maelstrom. And one of the buttons that it encourages you to do is generally what in that cycle you would drop, which would be Stormstrike, because it's the non-fire themed one. So
yeah,
it really flusters an already very flustered rotation.
Yeah, just moving Cycle of Elements out of the same talent tier as Fire Nova, really, like, it's easy to say, oh yeah, you know, that would make Fire Nova work, but it doesn't solve the problem of there's just way too many buttons that are going to displace this great nature-themed stuff that we have going on with Crash Lightning, Stormstrike, and Chain Lightning.
Yeah, I think the thing is that there's a lot of that you can romanticize Fire Nova quite well, because obviously in the past it's been very good, but the playstyle that this encourages, I think for most people, myself included, it is extremely overwhelming to actually keep up with. efficiently, and will be even more so if there's any fight mechanics that impede that at all.
And it also kind of demands add-on or recourse support in order to pull it off well, I think.
Yeah, if you see me on stream, I'm like tabbing around like, what, where that one's falling off, which one do I do? It's a mess.
Although just with all of these things though, just to bring it back a little bit, the situation with enhancement isn't bad. There's a lot of classes that are suffering worse right now. Mostly what we're trying to sort of insinuate here is it's going in the right direction. It just needs a little nudge to get over the line. I'd say we're comparative to BFA, like 60 to 70% of the way there. Whereas in BFA, we launched around 20-30% of the way towards a functional spec.
Yeah, you make a good point. You know, if we were to go live, if we were to go all of beta without having any additional class changes, the worst thing that would happen is we would just have a bunch of talents that should be cool but just aren't really supported. You probably just wouldn't play Fire Nova. You know, depending on tuning, Lashing Flames and Hot Hand might be fine. You know, it's just if we were to go live today, it'd be okay.
And the other thing as well is that we don't strictly want these parts of the playstyle to be removed. It's just a little bit more towards that direction could bring it all together. It's a case of the ideas behind it are good. It just needs a little bit of a nudge to finish it off and get to the end point.
Spot. We're just not far from being awesome.
And more importantly, the gap between the quality on live versus the quality on Shadowlands right now, even playing in terrible gear without covenants and soulbinds and everything on top of that, we play, I would say, distinctly better than we have done for a very long time on live.
Okay, cool. Well, I thought we were going to be like 20-30 minutes on trying to get through this part, but we're at 40. No, I should have probably seen that coming. Hekili, do we have any good questions on covenants? I'm wondering if we should spend, you know, a couple minutes covering covenants really fast, or if we have questions that we can address that we'll answer that.
Well, first of all, good job on the time check. You just beat me to it. We do have some questions about covenants. And the person who wanted to ask it isn't present, but Freyaz had asked if there is a best covenant that you guys are seeing at this point, whether there's one that's best for all three specs, for those people that end up multi-specking in Shadowlands.
So really quick before we get into that specific question, so the way we wanted to kind of structure this community event was kind of similar to like a convention panel. You know, you go to a panel, some folks talk for 15-20 minutes, and then they open up the questions. So this is where we're going to shift into that question answering mode. So this will be directly off of the questions that you guys have asked.
So when it comes to covenants, I've played with all of them quite a bit personally, and if it's a case of which one works for all three specs, unfortunately right now for enhancement there's only actually one that I think is functional, so that limits it to, if you want it to work for all three, if there's only one that works for one of them, then that's the only one that works, full stop, which is Windfury Totem.
Yeah, I'm logging over real quick. So
it's difficult to disagree with that. Like, in theory, the Venthyr one, I think, can work with tuning and bug fixes with its interaction with Maelstrom Weapon. But it's difficult. Like, I think it kind of needs to inherit the Chain Lightning hook with Crash Lightning.
Yeah, exactly. I think Chain Harvest is the closest one to being usable by enhancement of the four that isn't Vesper. Yeah.
Yeah, other than Kyrian Vesper Totem, yeah.
While Fey Transfusion and Primordial Wave are... There are too many quirks or too much of a disruption to the rotation to actually make them feasible regularly. Obviously, when we talk about these, we're just talking about the abilities because the Soulbinds, Conduits, and so on are relatively incomplete. Although we have access to some Soulbinds now, we haven't really played with all of them. so we can only judge off that. And in this situation, Vesper is, I would say, leaps and bounds ahead of the others, if only just because of the non-disruptive nature of it and the fact that you can activate the utility very easily.
Yeah, it's not disruptive. It like he said, it's the utility is easy to access. Like even just like for example, like dropping a healing stream totem will activate like the heal pulse, for example. Like it's easy to make full use of that ability. With Chain Harvest, the problem is you've played with it more recently. I don't know how many bugs are still active with it. Like, do you want to run down like how it plays like versus like what it has or doesn't have compared to like our other Maelstrom spenders?
So Chain Harvest's largest problem, I think, is that it displaces your Chain Lightning casts for no real actual payoff. Obviously, that's tuning related, but if you have that, it disrupts the rotation. It doesn't work with any of the Maelstrom spending hooks, so it doesn't trigger Hailstorm, and it doesn't trigger some of the Soulbinds attached to it, which is a bug as far as I'm aware. But the payoff is slightly more targets, but the damage isn't really there. And the healing payoff as well, if you happen to press it and you don't need the healing at that time, is fairly inconsequential when you compare it to something like Vesper, where you can bank those healing charges and then use them when you need them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also one of the few saving graces that Fey Transfusion does have, where you can have that healing bank and use it separately, which is where I think innately that's the superior aspect of that versus Chain Harvest.
Mm-hmm. But if Chain Harvest's tuning and bugs were fixed, it would be another non-disruptive ability that you could just, it would be like you casting this instead of a Chain Lightning, and it would just work.
If they turned it into a super Chain Lightning, it would, I would say that and Vesper Totem would work perfectly fine with the rotation. I think there'd be pluses and minuses to both of them, but if they did that, it's quite an easy fix to bring it up.
With Fey Transfusion, like one of the main issues is that for the base specs kit, like so much of its AoE relies on generating Stormbringers and generating Maelstrom charges. And when you plop down and start channeling Fey Transfusion, you're not doing either of those things. Like you're just sitting there doing damage. In theory, it could be tuned to the point where that damage was worth not generating those procs, but right now it's just not there.
Yeah, it's the only really Fey Transfusion's kind of like the elephant in the room. The only way to make it work is to make it so overpoweringly, like, make it do so much insane amount of damage that it like makes up for standing there doing nothing else. It's really the only way it'll work.
I don't know if I agree with it being the elephant in the room. I think it's third. I think Primordial Wave is by far the worst of the four.
I'll actually agree with that.
I have to apologize as well. When I relog, the game actually shuts down, so I have to restart the stream for anyone who's there. But I was going to swap to one that had Fey Transfusion just to show how cumbersome it is to actually make use of.
And while you're doing that really quick, it turns out that Freyaz is here, and I just wanted to give an opportunity to see if there's any clarifying or follow-on questions since I had spoken up for him. So or her, I'm not sure. I'm unmuting you now if you have a question. You should be able to speak if you want to unmute yourself and weigh in.
They have their headset muted as well. So
yeah, no,
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So if there's any additional clarification that you have,
no, that
Great.
clarified, and it was the answer I feared. Sadly,
was this the question that was related to cross specs?
Exactly.
yeah.
Okay.
It's just a situation where right now, like only one of the abilities really works, quote unquote, with the enhancement kit. So if you're concerned about being able to play all of them, coincidentally it also works very well with the other two specs. Obviously, some people don't like totems in general, so they don't necessarily want to use Vesper Totem. But right now, that is by far the ability that works best with all three specs, I would say.
I think, yeah, I think that there's definitely things they could do to the other abilities to solve a lot of those problems. Like Chain Harvest, for instance, I think for both Enhance and Ellie, should probably additionally cast a Chain Lightning. Restoration, it could also additionally cast a Chain Heal. I don't think that would break the ability or make it overpowered. I think it would just bring it in line with the usability and lack of disruptiveness that, you know, Vesper Totem has. And that's what all the Covenant abilities should strive to do.
And the other important thing with Vesper is that there is occasional moments of downtime when you play Enhancement. If you mismanage things or things just happen to sync up at the incorrect time based on where you juggled your Maelstrom. And Vesper is more frequently able to capitalize on the downtime than any of the other four as well. Or the other three, sorry. While Fate Transfusion will disrupt your further cooldowns because of the length of the channel, things will tend to come up that you were locked for a second or two from during the channel.
And another thing to mention about Fate Transfusion, I'll get sorry to interrupt Rusa and word up, but while you're spending all that time channeling, you don't necessarily just have one thing come off cooldown. You might have 2 or 3 cooldowns pile up, and then you have to use one of them, delay the others by GC, use the next one, delay the last one by GC, use that one, and while you've been spending all those GCs, you might have another bunch of cooldowns come up. So it doesn't really nicely fit into that minimized cooldown downtime, goal of the spec.
You're saying we're gonna have downtime. You think that's gonna be a case for the rest of the expansion, or is it just because we have low haste and all that stuff?
I think the downtime right now, given the situation with our rotation, it's something that I think there's a few other questions about. But it's low enough right now that with more gear, it's going to go even lower. And the downtime is extremely sporadic. Usually a lot of the downtime can be fixed solely by Sundering, which is a 40-second cooldown, and that on its own is enough to bridge many of the gaps.
Yeah, and the characters that are available to test with on Alpha are very poorly geared. So it's even with, extremely low haste and everything, it's the spec, there's not very much downtime at all. It was to the point where before they did the talent tree revisions, and there were a lot of abilities in the talents in the talent tree that gave you even extra abilities. There just wasn't anywhere to put all of them. So I think that the pacing is actually in a pretty good space right now for the base kit. It's just that some Covenant abilities, to get back to the original question, disrupt that and others don't. So the ones that disrupt it, they kind of need to have some other huge overpowered thing to justify the disruption. Otherwise, there's no reason to use them.
The only knock I'll give on Vesper Totem, I know we're singing its praises, but the only knock I'll give on it is that it's not going to do well with movement. It can be repositioned, but it costs a GCD to do so.
No, it's off GCD, the movement part. It's been removed from it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's just like a totemic projection from Warlords and Mop, if anyone remembers that. It's the same icon as well. And you can just immediately drag it around.
I know when I was messing around with it before, it was really annoying trying to move it.
And the primary thing with Vesper is the banking of the healing, I think, because utility is something that is relevant, especially from an enhancement point of view. Having more of that, being able to support the rest of the group, is something that's not irrelevant, which is the same reason that I think the Primordial Wave fundamentally fails, because it's the only one that doesn't do that. And Primordial Wave also is extremely disruptive to make use of, for the exact same reason that Chain Harvest has problems. If you want to get the payoff of the multiple flame shocks into a big lightning bolt that chains to things, while that's nice, that means that you aren't spending Maelstrom on Chain Lightning, then you're disrupting the AoE, because it has no interaction with that button.
There's also I'm of the opinion that there's also a potential tuning, like a nightmare tuning scenario here, where all of our Covenant abilities are pretty much designed around AoE. They all hit multiple targets, and they all seem to be somewhat balanced around that. So there's really only 2 tuning points we're gonna hit here. Either they're gonna be pretty good for single target and ridiculous for AoE, or they're gonna be pretty good for AoE and kind of crap on single target. So I'm of the opinion that there needs to be some additional hooks against very low target counts to make them exciting.
And since they've already implied that there's going to be a relatively high cost that could be up to 2 weeks, to swap these covenants. Vesper is too versatile at this stage from just an ability point of view for it to really encourage you letting play anything else. From my take.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement. So we spent a good amount of time on this covenant question specifically because we were gonna cover it as part of our talk earlier, but two birds, one stone. So, Hekili, you wanna give us another one?
Yeah, I'm gonna move us forward from the covenant topic, and we can come back to it later on because there are some more questions that we could follow on with. But we also have several other good questions to get through. So, Prayaz, thanks for bringing that one. We also have discussion about the GCD lock and the priority and how that's feeling in general. If we're feeling like it's open, if it's full, if it's over full, that's sort of combining a couple of questions from Vesh and from Emerhall.
I feel like we've kind of covered that topic a bit.
As we showed
already.
with the rotation before, when we were showing how it looks when it plays, you can see that generally speaking, the rotation is relatively full with occasional downtime, as opposed to there is a fixed point of downtime. And most of the situations that cause you to have downtime, they can be attributed to your own mistakes with the way that you juggle to the rotation. So the more comfortable you get, the lower the downtime tends to be when you first enter playing the spec. There are some talents that on the surface look like it fills those holes, but some of them don't necessarily. I would say that the only one that realistically does is Sundering and Stormfury. The others tend to have a bit more of a clash.
All right, very good. Yeah, and there's just sort of another follow-up question about the build of enhancement. We're being asked whether, when we see Stormkeeper coming in or we see some of the talent changes, the new Hailstorm, are we seeing that this is going to allow for a variety of builds, or are we going to be probably using a couple cookie cutter specs?
I think that is going to heavily depend on tuning or any additional class changes we might see. I think right now, if you were to make that judgment right now, I think there's probably going to be like one, maybe two options.
I would say if we took where we are right now and it gets tuned or altered to function better, in some cases, you're going to get two fairly distinct paths down the tree. And then there's some float talents that ultimately have their own problems. But you'd have like the build that I'm using right now, if we exclude the 50 row, because I think right now the 50 row has got a lot of problems on its own. But you've got a build that's more focused on Stormstrike and Maelstrom Weapon, and then you'd have like a fire build that orients itself around Fire Nova, Lashing Flames, Flame Shocks, and so on, so long as they fix the hook that's lacking to make that build pay off. But these are all talents that play into each other relatively well as a package rather than an individual talent.
Okay, so it sounds like we have a couple of, like, two main builds probably, but there's a little bit of flexibility in there for circumstances. All of that subject to tuning.
Yeah.
It's been pretty historical that a lot of our abilities on each tiers kind of fulfill the same function. So it usually ends up being just math, which one's better. That's a little bit different today, but I'd say we're still pretty far from really having like mechanical choice in the tree.
I would say compared to live, I like the design direction of many of the new talents that they introduce. Not all of them, obviously. Like I said earlier, like I'm still not thrilled with Cycle of the Elements. I don't think that one's ever going to be able to survive or pay off or to see any use. But like, or Totem Mastery for that matter. But the tuning is obviously it's still not there to support the multiple builds. I don't think. Like I think on current alpha, you might be able to swap one or two talents.
Yeah, if we took the tuning from right now, there is effectively only one build, which is what I have on now. aside from 50 again. I have to caveat that all of the 50 talents have
Yeah, the 50
some
talent,
very serious issues.
I mean, we should mention what those briefly what those issues are. Like,
Okay, so
the transition away from the Maelstrom resource has left elemental spirits in kind of a weird spot, right? Like on live, again, I'm only talking design. I'm not talking about tuning. On live, you get double fire wolves, and okay, that could encourage you to, raise the priority of lava lash in theory. Like, and it did do that with like the primal primer build or whatever. Like, you were excited to see double fire wolf, or if you got the storm wolves, you would be more excited about spamming your Stormstrike or proccing Windfury or whatever, doing like AoE. Obviously, the frost one, we didn't have any frost ability, so it was just a generic damage buff. So whatever. But like the spirit of that talent was that you could react to the buff and like change your playstyle a little bit to around that buff. You can't do that when every ability is on a fixed cooldown. Like you get double firewolves, cool. Your lava lash is still on a 12-second cooldown, so you're only going to hit it once or twice during the window anyway. You can't do anything in response to what you're seeing there. So the randomness of the buffs feels less meaningful in that it won't alter your playstyle. So it's like just purely RNG in terms of throughput of whether you got the good buff or the bad buff, and that's it. Like there's no potential for gameplay improvement there unless they drastically alter that.
Yeah, the issue is that the elemental spirits is a bit backwards. It's too archaic for what they've changed. When it comes to Earth and Spike, I find personally, although I think I can relatively concisely explain, the largest issue with Earth and Spike is what it would do is encourage you to spend Stormstrike and your Maelstrom Weapon in that window to actually capitalize on it, because those are the two things that have the highest scaling with it. But in doing that, you could displace other cooldowns because you're trying to make use of Earth and Spike. So even though it adds a button into the rotation, it disrupts the rotation when it falls off. And then you then create downtime that would have been instead served better if you'd have just played the rotation more naturally with the right flow. And the same extends to Ascendance's problems. Now that Stormstrike is no longer the be-all, end-all of the rotation, as a cooldown itself, for 3 minutes, it's fairly low impact, because it's always taking away from the other cooldowns that would cycle in between. There's no interaction with Maelstrom, so your Maelstrom could also interact with the Windstrike cooldown and disrupt that, especially if there is Stormbringer procs that happen in between. So it's become largely, instead of a cooldown row that enhances brief windows at different rates or situations, they're all fairly low impact because they're on such long timers.
Yeah, and speaking of cooldowns, Feral Spirit has historically been a pretty weak cooldown. There are definitely times when it's been incredibly powerful, like Wrath, when there's all sorts of old videos of people getting blown up by double wolves. But Kata and beyond, Feral Spirit on their own have been a pretty low damage, low impact cooldown. That's largely true today. They do generate some Maelstrom Weapon stacks, so it's not like they do nothing. I'm just of the opinion that
I will chime in that part of it that they've added where it generates some Maelstrom, while it's not super impactful, it is better than it generating just Maelstrom carte blanche as like a resource when Maelstrom didn't matter. I think it's at least somewhere towards noticing that the ability itself is very low impact.
I think,
but it does need more.
That up.
It needs more.
I think they should dial that up. Like, what I'm saying is like that old overcharge talent. That's kind of what they put onto Feral Spirit, but just less, right? Like overcharge would give you like 5 Maelstrom stacks immediately, and then generate another like 10 over the duration or whatever. This one is like gives you 1 immediately, and then like again generates like 1 every 3 seconds or whatever. Like you don't notice 1 charge popping up, right? You would notice like if you used Feral Spirit and you instantly got 5 charges, like that would be big impact. It would feel nice. You could instantly go into like a lightning bolt or a chain lightning or something. I think that's a bit more where that needs to be for it to feel good.
Yeah, definitely.
Kit has been lacking a solid cooldown since they removed Ascendance from the base in Legion, and Yeah, I wouldn't expect a whole lot from Feral Spirit as it is right now. I definitely think that there's a lot more they should do with it. That
It's
is
one of the holes, but
definitely-
it's also the holes that the 50 talent tree tier can shore up if they take a moment to look at the 3 options there, and that can be
And-
how we define our cooldown window.
To quickly draw this tangent to a close so we can get back to the questions on Ascendance, it's also obviously just very visually underwhelming, and you know the mop Ascendance was a lot cooler. Okay, Hekili, next question.
no, definitely. I'm finding those pictures and I'm putting them in the channel.
Yeah, definitely bring back Rad Blast, Storm Blast. Okay, I'm actually going to take us into the topic of legendaries. Publius had asked, of the announced enhancement legendaries, which are you most excited for mechanically, and do you anticipate that any will be the best?
I'll start that. So the legendary I'm most excited for isn't an enhancement legendary, actually. It's an elemental
Elemental one.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's the one where you use like an ability of one element and it buffs a different element, and then that element buffs a different element, and then that element buffs the first element or whatever.
It's
like
called Elemental Equilibrium.
yeah, like there's no reason enhancement couldn't use that legendary, but it's elemental restricted. And like just that one just feels the most fun of the ones that they've announced so far.
Just
So
to
I
point
would-
out, we
I
don't
would-
know whether or not there are restrictions, so it might simply just be usable. The main
Sure,
thing of why
it's
that one looks
possible.
really good is that it's like a much more realized version of Eye of the Twisting Nether and Natural Harmony, which were 2 traits that effectively try and encourage the same kind of playstyle, but had no real mechanical interaction. It was a very dull, do the thing, get the buff. This is much more like a cycle of the elements, maybe? Like a talent that we have?
It's also a really well designed legendary in that it will drastically change everything we've been talking about, like rotational directives, how you're going to play the class in Shadowlands. That's a good design legendary because it's going to subvert all of that. There are going to be times you're like, in order to use this properly, you're going to have to force things on cooldowns to put things in the correct order to make sure you maximize the amount of buffed attacks you do. That's going to happen with that legendary if we're able to use it. So that's just on multiple layers is just a fun sounding and really potentially really well designed legendary.
I will say as well, though, that all of the enhancement specific ones are more interesting than a lot of other classes legendaries that have shown up. I think Doomwind's returning, even though it's attached to Windfury Weapon. I think that's fine. That's
Windfury
an
Totem.
interesting addition. Sorry, yeah, Windfury Totem, which is like a half global because you're dropping a totem, and you've got
Yeah, but it's still
now
minimal.
new hooks like Forceful Winds and Stormfury that are all now exist for Windfury, which never existed in Legion.
Mhm.
I think that could be an interesting additional cooldown that you can invest in as a legendary if you need more cooldowns. Legacy of the Frost Witch attaches more benefit to Maelstrom Weapon. It adds more punch to the spender that we want it to be. The Spirit Wolf one, Feral Spirits one with Maelstrom Weapon, Generation Chance, and CDR. I think there's recursive synergy with the fact that Feral Spirits generating it, and it's also coming up more frequently for a cooldown perspective. And the Lava Lash ones, while probably the most dull right now, potentially has a lot of different hooks if they fix the problems with the fire tree, because obviously, as is alluded to, the hook that needs to be fixed for the fire tree is that there needs to be a spread aspect to Flame Shock. And if that happens, that legendary will be extremely interesting.
We do
Well,
have
that-
a few questions around that I want to insert, since you mentioned the need for a spread. And so along those lines, do you see ideal places to hook a spread mechanic for Flame Shock to support Fire Nova and
Yeah.
other mechanics?
We've brainstormed a few. That's a good question. I mean, there's the obvious like, oh, just go back to what we had in the past with Lava Lash spreading Flame Shock. Probably should be reined in a little bit compared to what it was before, because Blizzard's intentionally trying to pull AOE, uncapped AOE back. I think if Lava Lash were to spread like even just one Flame Shock, that would go a long way towards helping spread it. I'd like to see it be at least 2. I think that's a reasonable compromise between spreading and not being overpowered.
I think,
but there's a lot
moreover,
of room
though,
to just
in
be
this case,
creative with
just bringing it back, like basically with a Lava Lash spread, Flame Shock doesn't do irrelevant damage, and so it would come at the cost. And we already have a fairly consistent AoE package. So, personally, from my point of view, I think that one of the talents should be removed, and it becomes, like, say, if we remove Crashing Storm and we slot it in that Crash Lightning spreads Flame Shock, the talent will probably be damage neutral to Crashing Storm just by virtue of the damage that Flame Shock does on its own, but it also enables the rest of the tree.
Well, that's the reason why I wouldn't necessarily like that, is I don't think a talent should be required for another talent to function.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I think there could be a talent to improve it. Like, let's say there is a baseline spread mechanic, and there's a talent to make the spread mechanic better that encourages playstyle, but doesn't lock 2 talents together. I think that there's a lot of room to get creative. I've brainstormed some ideas personally. Like, I think that Flame Shock itself could have a chance to just spread every single time it ticks. You could do some sort of interaction with Flame Tongue Weapon and Flame Shock. We have some fire abilities that
It could just be every time you deal fire damage, Flame Shock has a chance to jump.
Yeah, or it could be that Flame Shocking an already Flame Shock target, splits it into like 3. I don't know. There's just plenty of room for the fire abilities to do things together.
Okay, that's all very fair. On the backtracking one step to the legendaries conversation, our very first question from Scofan was regarding the general legendary, the deeply rooted elements that draws on the gloves from Legion. And it sounds like he was concerned about whether, since we're not really spamming Stormstrike in the way we were previously, that those gloves might be hindered a bit. Do we have any thoughts about that?
I personally will go out and put my neck on the chopping board that I think that the gloves were fairly unhealthy in Legion, and I'm sure people have heard me say that, so I'm not particularly thrilled that they're coming back. However, Ascendance, by virtue of the strength of the entire kit right now, is low enough that I think that those gloves, and the fact that the rate that it's going to proc itself is low enough, that I'm not sure whether you could realistically set a hook on those gloves fixing a Stormstrike spammy playstyle, especially given that equipping those is going to take away from some of the more consistent or interesting legendaries that it competes with.
Unless there's some crazy conduit combinations or something going on, the one button Stormstrike playstyle is probably going to be dead.
I think the most important part about those gloves is that when you played in Legion, it exacerbated the negative feeling of when things weren't happening. And that was probably the part of enhancement that I liked the least for the last 2 expansions in particular. And right now, at the very base of the kit, when you play right in the moment with Shadowlands, you don't get that many feelings of everything's stopped. I am now at a loss. I can't do anything. There's nothing that I can interact with. You have a secondary path that you can go down with the way that your rotation flows, where you still feel like you're impacting what you're doing, or you're heading towards a positive point. And reintroducing that aspect of it via a legendary or any other mechanic is something that I'm not thrilled by.
I don't know if I agree with everything there. I don't think the legendary was perfect in Legion, but I think it was a net positive in the sense that it gave Maelstrom value at the time. Like, again,
That I will agree with, yeah.
It was incredibly RNG, and if you didn't get your Ascendance procs, then oh well, you just did a million less DPS.
Or if you
I think
if you were generous and gave all of your ascendance procs to me, like you were.
I was
Rusa.
about to say.
Um,
I think that if you had someone in the raid siphoning off all your RNG.
so I mean that was nice of you, but again, it's a tuning thing, right? Like they could put it to a point where it was somewhat reliable and it kept you in ascendance longer. It's going to depend on what the uptime ends up being, and how if they do change ascendance at all to make it fit better with like the current playstyle, that could also alter how impactful or how cool that legendary feels.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of in between the agreement on the gloves and Legion. I think that I definitely think that if you were to take that design and apply it to like BFA enhance, it would have been like, just the most exaggerated version of Stormstrike spamming you'd ever seen in your life. And the gloves kind of led you in that direction. But I think it was what the spec needed at the time. I think it was like the best band-aid the spec could have, like Purge said.
Yeah,
It
I agree.
totally-
It felt like a band-aid in that time,
Yeah,
but it was
totally-
one that really did fix a lot of the internal hooks that were starting to show as being a bit rusty.
It definitely, it wasn't perfect, but it was what we needed at the time. So, I'm in between there. So,
But I'm very much more on the side of I enjoy the fact that we've had more player control reintroduced here,
so
and that there
we
are
definitely-
legendaries that do that.
yeah. So we definitely got off on a tangent there. The gloves, you're probably not going to see a Stormstrike spam playstyle come back. That's kind of what we're getting at.
And I think that's very on topic, and I think that's what we were looking for an answer to. So I appreciate the depth there. And it did take us on a trip down memory lane. So let's go a bit further back. And once upon a time, shamans
Story.
liked to go ahead and drop a stick in the dirt that would cause some extra attacks to happen in their groups. With Windfury Totem coming back, what are we seeing as the impact of that for shamans and enhancement in particular rating?
Who's asking these questions, by the way?
So we have a question. Part of that is from Asuriel or Leora in parentheses there. We also have Ziggy asking about whether we'll end up hating Windfury Totem by the end of the expansion. And we have some niche related questions from Dingus Khan that may tie together with that as well.
So what are we trying to find out here? Do we like Windfury? Do we not?
I think I can generally extrapolate what Windfury is doing right now is far more decided by what other classes gain from it than us.
Yeah, I agree with that heavily. I think that if you were to put all the melees together, any class that directly generates resource from White Swings is going to be the most powerful, and the obvious one there is like Arms Warriors.
And we also need to assume, just like when it comes to the Demon Hunter buff and the Monk buff and the Warrior buff and so on, which I will also say I don't agree with the buff meta.
Probably really like it too. Now that I'm thinking about it.
I don't like the buff meta personally, but since it's here, the ideal would be that this is an overhead. Like, our damage is going to be tuned without it in mind. It's just something that is on top. Unlike something like Stormlash that we had in Legion. So it's additional utility that extends past based on other players that are in the group.
And if we're comparing us to comparing Shadowlands and our Windfury utility to live, where one of the enhancement's biggest problems is that it doesn't bring anything that Elemental doesn't bring. And Elemental range spec, or enhancement doesn't have any unique abilities compared to like Elemental Resto in terms of utility. Basically, like they have extra stuff that they can do that we can't, but there's no reverse of that. And since they're ranged or healer, more valuable. So that was one of the biggest problems, especially in small scale groups where it's like there's limited melee spots. You want your, depending on what the meta was at the time, like you wanted your rogues or your demon hunters or your windwalker monks or whatever, and now you want your BM hunters or whatever like that. But Windfury is just another like reason to bring an enhancement shaman
that Elemental and Resto don't have. So
The other thing as well, I need to know, most importantly, because it's coming up in the chat there, while it does say party members, it has affected the entire raid group on alpha. So it's one or the other. You have to guess which one is the actual endpoint. But for the purposes of hoping for the best, we'd assume that it just affects everyone.
Yeah,
you can always just put the arms wearers in the party of the Enhancement Shaman anyway, so even if it does become party bound, it's not a big deal because they're the ones that will gain the most from it by far. And it's like not trivial, like it's just a straight up like 10% damage increase for arms warrior for some reason. So it's just like, okay, give that buff to them. Like
yeah, I think
need Enhancement Shaman in the raid if you have like other melee that benefit from.
And there's ancillary things like some tanks are going to gain survival from it, like Protection Warrior in particular. They're going to gain more access to things that keep them alive more.
Yeah,
so
absolutely,
there are external factors.
It's something additional that we are able to do that we didn't have in the past. It's something unique that we can do. That doesn't mean we get a raid slot. It definitely boils down to how much does everybody else get out of it, and how much of that benefit is going to come out of our own like tuning budget. Because it's definitely been in the past where Blizzard has given classes powerful abilities like that, and then they just gimp the hell out of that class.
And just because it's a powerful ability doesn't mean you have to like it. Like the question got of like, are we gonna hate it by the end of the expansion? Like with having to like move it between like trash pulls and stuff in Mythic Plus, whatever. Like it's not gonna take you until the end of the expansion to dislike it. Like it'll probably take you like a minute or two. Like totems, they came back because nostalgia, but there was a reason they were removed, and it's that they're not designed to play well. Like they're not fun abilities. They're thematic, but they're not fun. And I wish more of the abilities that came back to the game like had
then the viability of Windfury Totem goes out the window. If the extra damage isn't going to help you kill the fight, but having another immunity will, you lose your raid spot. So just because it may have a powerful damage benefit, if damage doesn't matter, we're kind of back in square one.
But that is like looking at the worst possible. At least it's more than what we have right now, which is the ultimate positive of it. While it is annoying to drop it frequently, and I really, really do think that if it's to stay, something like Totemic Projection should just come back. It's only a half global to drop it, so it's not as disruptive as has been alluded to in some places.
On that note, is there not a mechanic, and it may be Vesper Totem that does this, that lets you just use it again to move it without...
Yeah, Vesper has Totemic Projection attached to it internally. So when it's already down, it's replaced by that button, which could and is also off the global. So you could just do that for Windfury. If it's already down, you can have that.
You could do that for all of the totems.
Mana. So if you're like running around spamming it, you can't run out of mana.
Okay. And so I'm going to go ahead and take us to our next question that was submitted from the community. And this appears to be from a gentleman named Word Up. And it says, do you think Blizzard will ever support two-handed enhancement again?
I'm really disappointed that you're here, Serge. Because there's no way that question wasn't from you.
It was asked from Word Up. Word Up's not allowed to respond.
I mean, obviously, there's people in the community that want two-handed enhancement to come back, you included. But I do think there might be a little bit too many mechanical limitations in the way of making that happen in the short term.
All right, so Word Up, if you're here, did that answer your question?
Yeah, real quick on that though, like
to like non-meme it, to non-meme it, I'll nip this in the bud in the exact same way I have every other forum post. Because this is something that comes up a lot. While it might be fun to think that it would look cool if you had one, the fundamental mechanics that would be required to make two-hand work would require you to fracture the class in two. Because there are way too many things that are reliant on frequency of hits and number of imbues and so on. And if you did that, you would effectively halve the amount of design space available for enhancement because you would have to go in two different directions to make them both work. And I think doing that is a fundamental poor decision that results in the class coming out of beta worse. And ultimately, the thing that we actually want is the class to come out of beta looking really good.
I think that as a compromise, like, if they were to add some sort of transmog option, I think it's unlikely, but if they were to, I think I wouldn't care. I think that I don't see any reason why they shouldn't, just to placate a desire that people have.
I agree. I think there's other steps that go further down that, of where if you give an inch, people want a mile, where they can transmog it but it doesn't feel like it, and the animation issues of two-hand and things.
Yeah, I mean, even
but
on the
all of those things,
not that big a deal.
It's not a hill to die on, but a hill to die on is that they shouldn't try to mechanically implement it.
I don't know. I think this animation looks pretty good with crash lighting.
Oh, yeah,
I'm
no,
really
Crash
enjoying
Lighting
watching you stand there for
great.
3 seconds in between.
Yeah, that's pretty painful.
Just look at the gameplay.
I appreciate your willingness to engage with a question that I know you enjoy so much, so thank you for that. I do want to take us into another piece of Shadowlands content we haven't talked about, because we do have a question from Ziggy asking if there were any interesting or crazy Anima Power combinations that you encountered playing in Torghast.
I suppose I'm the one who did Torghast the most, right? So
I've
this
done
is
it
a
a
me.
bunch on Enhance, so...
I think when you look at a lot of classes, there are like varying ones. Enhancement tends to come down to there's only really one path, and that's just a totem path. As unpleasant as that might sound to some people, there are a lot of powers that have a lot of interaction with totems that also increase your damage, that make you borderline immortal. Those powers, when you combine them, where you're dropping 2 totems at once, the number of totems that are down increase your damage. You're dropping resto totems by accident. You spam Windfury to just generate random totems. Those power combinations, alongside when you drop a totem, you gain Ascendance and Bloodlust. They're all work together pretty well, but it is just the one singular path that tends to all coalesce together.
Yeah, the times I've played Torghast, like, if you don't get that path offered to you, it just feels like you're not really playing Torghast. Like, because the other hooks that the spec has, and part of it is, again, the same problem that we have with Covenant abilities, where like they try to make them apply to like all 3 specs, and that usually just doesn't work.
I will say, however, there are some powers, such as the Chain Harvest power related to Flame Shock, giving it a spread that by itself shows how much you could enable Fire Nova existing just by virtue of one single power.
That one Torghast power makes Fire Nova work. Like, you know, if you get that power while it's Chain Harvest Day or whatever, like you can just like in the middle of the run just respec to Fire Nova and it feels fun. But, you know, by the same token, when it's Chain Harvest Day, oftentimes you'll find you just like don't even end up using Chain Harvest until you get like a power like that, because base ability is just bad.
Although it is nice to see that there is an example that can show in practice what the suggestion would result in.
Yeah, there are a couple powers that relate to some of the early questions about Stormstrike spamming. So there are some powers like I think it's 50 stacks after 50 Stormbringer activations. The cooldown on your Stormstrike is half, and then there's one that gives you Ascendance the entire duration you're in Bloodlust, and that ends up turning Windstrike into a 1 GCD cooldown. So there is definitely some potential to have some of the older feeling playstyle back. But that being said, that getting ridiculous is still enabled by that whole totem path, which just gives you insane amounts of damage.
Are the bugs still there with like the Bloodlust hooks, talents, or
Yeah,
traits?
they're still there.
Oh yeah, it's all messed up.
Oh yeah, and so part of the problem is also part of the Bloodlust trait is also piggied off of the totem path, where you drop a totem and you get like 4 seconds of Bloodlust or whatever. So it's like totems are something that all 3 specs share, so it's easy to make a hook that works for all 3 specs off of totems, you know. But then you get to something generic like, okay, your lightning bolt does 30% more damage. Okay, that's not really fun, but sure. And especially like with the current tuning of lightning bolt, it's also something that you don't really want.
Yeah, you're effectively you've got a big pool of things that affect generic abilities like lightning bolt or shocks, and then you've got a small pool that's affecting bloodlust, and then you've got a very, very large pool that's affecting just totems, and that's the whole Torghast package for Shaman right now.
I personally would like to see more cross enhancement and elemental. Like, I'd personally like to see more cross spec hooks. Like, I think it could be fun if they added things like Crash Lightning also drops an Earthquake. And they could do cross things for elemental, like
or it could also just as easily
in the other direction, but like I definitely think that there's things that they could do in other directions to make us more of like a spell related build and get us away from the totem thing.
You can look at Havoc and Vengeance as a good example, where they have a lot of crossover abilities that it's one or the other. So for us, it would be it interacts with Crash Lightning, and then for Elemental, it interacts with Earthquake. And then you'd have, for us, it's Stormstrike, for them, it's Lava Burst. These kind of things, because there is already one that does transition between Lava Surge and Stormbringer. Those are the kind of things that I think would be really nice to see.
All right. As we're kind of getting closer to the end of our time here, are there any specific items you haven't covered? Any specific mechanical interactions that you think enhancement really needs to be fully functional going into Shadowlands?
I think fully functional is kind of a sort of one of those moving goalpost things. If moving fully functional is in like the class plays, then you'd be okay with it. I think we're pretty much there now.
Except for the fire abilities.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think we're there now, except for some minor things that need to change.
I wouldn't call the fire things minor.
I would say, to beat a dead horse, the thing that is important that probably does need a look in is the disparity in survival. Because that is still relevant, and it's not going away. And others have seen increases, others have seen some things dialed back, but they were so far ahead that they're still ahead of us right now. And our survival situation is, generally speaking, quite tragic.
Yeah, it's actually worse than live. So yeah, it's good that you brought that one up, because, you know, obviously on live, you know, you have a big pool of Maelstrom Weapon, you can just belt out a bunch of instant heals back to back, and they don't hit that hard, but, you know, you can at least, you know, chain them. With the way the Maelstrom works on alpha, you know, you've got 1, maybe 2 casts, and then, you know, you're generating Maelstrom Weapon again for the next, you know, like 5 to 10 seconds before you can get your next one out, at least instant cast. And our heals still have the problem where, since they're, you know, attack power based, you know, it doesn't scale at the same rate as our health pool. So like at the start of the expansion, they kind of feel like maybe they're worth using. And then toward the end, it's like, okay, I just cast Healing Surge and I got like, you know, 4% of my health back.
And the opportunity cost is raised immeasurably.
Like on live, like we're at the point where my Memory of Lucid Dreams proc, like while I'm running Fury of Air build, heals for like
you know, 3/4 of a healing surge. Like the proc heals for almost as much as a healing surge. It's like healing surge is just really, really bad.
That's been a problem
Yeah.
for a long time, though. For as long as Blizzard wants to keep adding flat stamina boosts into the game, but not buff base healing power, that's going to be a problem. I feel
Also,
like one alternative
note-
is that those powers that increase your stamina abilities for DPS specs should probably also increase all your healing abilities.
Also note the fact that Chain Heal does more than Surge right now for us. Because they are effectively in the same bracket, because the limiter is Maelstrom Weapon, which is the high opportunity cost, but a Chain Heal will heal more, and other people, than a Surge will.
Yeah, I'm kind of fine with that since it costs more mana, so you can't use it as much.
I'm okay with it. I think it's fine. However, I think our limiter is Maelstrom, not mana, because we aren't going to stand and chain cast.
Well, that's what I'm saying is if you are in the situation where you have to chain cast, you can't use chain heal as much as you can use healing surge.
It's also a significantly slower cast than
Yeah,
healing
it's also
surge,
a slower
1.4
cast.
versus
Like if
2.3.
you get to the point where you've run out of your Maelstrom and you have to actually hard cast healing spells, like I mean obviously you're fucked either way, but yeah.
Yeah, I think effectively we need more reactive survival, and someone mentioned Necrolord could fix it, but fundamentally Necrolord's thing is
problem
good,
is the rest of Necrolord.
but when you pick that, Necrolord's ability is effectively fairly non-existent, and the soul binds that exist right now for Necrolord are also fairly poor relative to the others, and
Problem
you're
is if you pick
sacrificing
Necrolord,
too many
you get
things.
Primordial
Yeah.
Wave.
And a 4-second channel for a 20/50% shield in a spec that's incredibly global heavy or cooldown locked, that is a really, really heavy investment to get that shield. In the same way that Spirit Wolf has the same problem of having to sit in Ghost Wolf to actually stack it up, it's the exact same issue with Necrolord.
Speaking of shields, Earth Shield should probably be better.
What that it now clashes with Lightning Shield, I think, is fairly egregious.
Well, no, I don't think that it clashing with Lightning Shield is egregious. I think the previous problem that Lightning Shield didn't exist was a problem that needed to be fixed, and now that Lightning Shield exists, the problem is the design of Earth Shield isn't only competing against the other two talents on its row; it's also competing against Lightning Shield because it's mutually exclusive with Lightning Shield. So it's in a weird spot. Like I kind of don't feel like Earth Shield should be a talent. Like I think we should get something else like Ancestral Guidance.
Yeah,
or
I
something
agree.
in its place.
I agree that it doesn't have a place anymore because it's competing with something. But it's also competing. At the absolute base, it shouldn't overwrite it if it has to exist.
Yeah, if it has to exist, it shouldn't be exclusive with Lightning Shield. Although that's the play. You get two shamans.
Shield,
You Earth Shield the other shaman, you can still have Lightning Shield.
Yep,
Oh
that's
my
the
god.
way you do it. All right, 2
That's why we need 3 enhancement that we can all cycle shields across each
3?
other.
No, you're not getting shields. It's just me and Persh.
Very nice. There is a question here from Tin Man on this topic of, you know, survivability and self heals and enhancement historically being this hybrid, or, you know, shamans being a hybrid really. Do you see, you know, spending Maelstrom Weapon on Chain Heal being a piece of utility that's make or break in any particular setting in the game?
Not with the current tuning. Like I think all of our Maelstrom spells, including the healing ones, should hit like 2 to 3 times harder. I think the downside that we're currently the spells are like the base spells are nerfed by like 50% in the aura. That's fine. So an enhancement summon can't just sit there and like, you know, chain cast lightning bolts and be an effective range DPS, or chain cast, you know, super heals and be an effective healer. It's fine for it to be Maelstrom limited. But I feel like if an enhancement shaman decides to blow their Maelstrom charges on a chunky heal, they should be able to do that, because ideally speaking, they're sacrificing, you know, a heavy hitting lightning bolt or chain lightning to do it. Obviously, the tuning isn't there right now, but I think that's fine.
What's the paladin ability? Word of Glory?
Well, that's been
changed also.
removed.
I'm saying
on BFA,
I
like on BFA, I like that ability. Like I'll pop that and boom, you know, all of the Grievous stacks are gone.
And it
Like
costs holy power,
that feels cool.
But
I think
Holy power, right?
all three of us agree that when enhancement has been a pseudo support healer in between being a DPS, when that's actually paid off properly, it's been very enjoyable and very useful to a raid. But that
Incredible.
hasn't been realized for the better part of 6 years.
yeah, I would also add on to that that even though we got like a bunch of quote hybrid abilities back, like with Healing Stream Totem and Chain Heal and like all that stuff, that doesn't mean that the spec feels like a hybrid because those abilities are still weak. Like an enhancement shaman does less healing than a rogue, I would say, pretty comfortably. Like it feels weird. It's like in a weird spot. Like our healing spells are very awful, even though we have a healing spec.
Yeah, it's no secret that I think that the time that the enhancement was the most viable and the most useful was Mists of Pandaria, when quite honestly enhancement added up to half of a healer.
Well,
And you
in
saw
particular, at parts of
shaman-
Mr. Pandaria, it was also a very unrealized situation where not many people seem to realize just how broken the design
Yeah,
was.
So,
Obviously, that's taking it to the extremes, but it would be nice to get somewhere towards that direction if they want it to be a pseudo hybrid.
yeah, so enhancement literally counted as, like, if you look at the HPS numbers at the end of a really heavy, intensive, heavy healing fight, 2 enhancement shamans equaled another healer in raid cooldowns. And like Ward said, if that was, if other communities had paid more attention to what enhancement could do, you would have seen that in world progression races. And it was the one time that you could say, okay, we want that enhancement shaman in because the end of Raw Den is crazy healing and he's gonna do insane amounts of numbers. We want them in. And that's not something you normally hear. So,
I mean, and again,
and I'm not saying that we need that to be viable, but
well, here's the thing though. In one of the big things about Mists of Pandaria off healing was Lightning Bolt was like 5% of our damage, like in alpha at that time. So like sacrificing a Lightning Bolt to drop, a Healing Storm empowered Healing Rain and popping AG and, funneling all that extra healing into the raid, there wasn't a big opportunity cost attached to that. I feel like we could have powerful off healing if, lightning bolt was like 20-25% of your damage. So if you, weren't casting your lightning bolts, your damage would noticeably go down if you
and
were
that doesn't
throwing out the
necessarily
heals
mean
instead.
that you do 25% less overall damage. It just means that those moments, where you
It means that you're sacrificing
you
a
would
bit.
have the opportunity to do it.
It means that you're looking at it that it's more valuable for the raid if you provide healing rather than you provide a little bit more damage, which I think those kinds of decisions are very interesting. And it's the exact same deal with Word of Glory for Paladins. It's an interesting choice on live right now, to sacrifice Holy Power to do Word of Glory for the sake of your raid rather than do another Divine Storm.
Man, we are great at getting off on tangents. What was the original question? Is the class finished?
No, that one was about healing and being a hybrid and using Maelstrom Weapon on healing.
right,
so
right.
I feel like we're still on topic, and actually, we have a related question to that. That's probably our last formal question based on the time. But Contreras or Pudding asks a Mythic Plus related question about the whole phenomenon around Fury of Air and Lucid Dreams, bringing in that self-healing survivability. And now we just have sort of Earth Shield left in the talent tree. Static Charge, he says, is a pretty dead talent. Do we have something else, or is there something else we should have to sort of bring that kind of healing or survivability into Mythic Plus?
Saying I don't think Static Charge is necessarily a dead talent in Mythic Plus.
I do.
I think it's a pretty egregious example of a dead talent.
Yeah, Static Charge has no use case.
The issue, I think, that the Lucid Dreams Fury of Air thing is almost entirely an accident. That much like has happened with other classes, where an essence or something else has had an unusual interaction. You can look at Havoc and Corruption as a great example of where it just so happened that there would be an extreme use case. That's what Fury of Air and Lucid felt like to me. It was very, very useful to have, and having it removed is going to be something that is very tangible because there's no longer an alternative.
But I would also say that Fury of Air Lucid combo traditionally hasn't been that useful in Mythic Plus because you need the utility of Sundering when you're pushing
that's
hierarchies in Mythic Plus.
Well, I
Like
think
sometimes you can justify it on like a Grievous week if it's a dungeon where you don't need those extra AoE interrupts, but generally you're going to be using Sundering in Mythic Plus anyway, so we're not necessarily losing that transitioning into Shadowlands.
Yeah, I think Fury of Air Lucid leans more towards the raid style of how much it helped certain parts of certain fights where you were a lot more durable than you would otherwise be when you're already a fairly low durability class regardless when you're in the raid. And losing that will be something that I predict will be felt pretty hard if there's no alternative in there.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm just kind of hung up on the static charge thing. I think the problem with static charge is more its competing talents are situationally just garbage. I don't think
No.
static charge is.
I think
terrible.
Spirit Wolf is... Earthshield is its own problem, but Spirit Wolf is actually, I will admit, despite my original predictions in BFA, I got a lot more use out of that than I thought I would.
Yeah,
The problem with static charge, is you don't need, like, there's not like a situation where it's like, oh, I wish I had an AoE stun every 40 seconds instead of every minute. Like it just doesn't come up. Like even in Mythic Plus, like you design your pulls around when you have your cooldowns available. It doesn't matter if it's like every 40 seconds or every minute. You just pull a little bit bigger so the pull lasts a little bit longer, and then you'll have your stun for the next pull.
Fair enough. I'm of the opinion that there's scenarios that Earthshield and Spirit Wolf can situationally provide no benefit, and it ends up being true for static charge too.
Just for the listeners here, I want you to know that at some point in Shadowlands, there's going to be a moment where Word Up or Surge spec into static charge for something, and they will immediately let Rusa know they finally found that use case for it. So it will be discussed later on.
I feel like that's unlikely. I feel like static charge is just it's in a spot where it's bad, but it's not like meme bad. Like let's talent into it for funsies. It's just bad. Like there's nothing fun about it.
I don't see any reason why.
Oh, I'm sure I could do it for funsies.
I will commit to our chat that if I see that happen, I will leak it into a public forum so you all get to see it. Okay, and so
you know what it's gonna be? This is gonna turn into one of those sundering situations where nobody uses it in Legion, and I get to tell everyone I told you so. Yeah, but you did it with Pride as. I did it without.
All right,
So I did
some
it.
history there. It's all good. It's all good. It's good to be a little salty. I am gonna go ahead and wrap up the Q&A portion here, and I know we have quite a few questions we didn't get to. I want the audience to know that we do plan to review these and try to answer more of them as best we can. I tried to fit in what would flow. I apologize if an essential question there got missed, but
just to interject quickly on that, the idea is that all the questions that didn't get checked off will either be put in like a written document out, or we'll just like get together and make a quick video and go through them all as well for the ones that we didn't, because there were, I would say, a lot more than we expected, especially earlier on.
Yeah.
So there was a lot to get through.
On a tangent there, I'm trying to get so on a tangent there, I'm trying to get Stormstrike.io, which was the planned website for Stormstrike enhancement specific information and feedback and articles and whatever we just felt like. There wasn't going to be any schedule. I was planning on getting that going for BFA. Everybody saw how BFA went.
And then that was a train wreck.
Yeah, so I basically abandoned that project. I'm trying to get that running again. If I can get that going, we'll probably, in addition to pinning the responses to the questions in this channel, we'll probably post them on there as well.
All right, I appreciate the follow-ons there. So yeah, we're definitely going to get through these. You'll get to see answers in a good format, video and probably written down as well. And we'll be looking for Stormstrike IO coming online with information for Shadowlands. I am going to steal my last comment here as moderator of the Q&A from Nick Pones, who is a man of many hats.
And Earthshrine's hero.
He provided us the commentary that he just wanted to say he loves you guys. Thank you for this event and all the things that you do for the community. And I think that rings true for a lot of people. So, we appreciate all the theory crafting that you three do, especially on behalf of the enhancement community. A lot of the understanding of the spec, each expansion, especially for the past 4 expansions now, really, has come from the 3 of you. I've seen the amount of time that you spend all on your own time, overnight, hours and hours, crunching numbers, running sims, retesting things, writing new priorities, and play testing all of it. And it's a huge service to the community. And I hope everybody appreciates it as much as they really should, because you do amazing work.
Thanks, guys.
I'm not really sure how to react. I'm not used to praise.
Yeah, I do it because it's fun.
I appreciate it very much, though. And shout out to Nick.
Mm-hmm.